Hello, and welcome back to Full Time with Meg Linehan. I am Tamerra, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, the Meg Linehan. Meg, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm in like a weird space where Liberty won WNBA, coming off the Celtics winning NBA last year.
Big
the
win.
rings are like, so as a basketball fan right at the moment, like I am thriving.
I love it.
Which is a very strange place to be.
I love it for you. Yeah, it's the transition from WNBA straight into NBA was like you maybe
Too
had
fast.
one time to blink twice.
Yeah.
But yeah.
We could like have a week off maybe in between these things just to emotionally recover, especially from that series. But you know, that's fine.
There are worse
We're here.
things to have to recover
We're ready
from.
to go.
All right, we have a lot to get to today, and I'm just going to say off the bat that this episode has a theme to it, and the theme is change. I think it reflects, the changing of the seasons. We are transitioning, we're slowing down, maybe like bunkering up, getting cuddled up for fall. But in the soccer world, we're also going through many, many different changes. The probably most pressing of which is the announcement from the current Chicago Red Stars to their rebranded new identity, Chicago Stars, dropping the red, Chicago Stars FC. We're going to be getting into that from top to bottom, left to right, every dimension. So of course, we're going to have to enlist the help of some friends of the pod, Steph Young, who y'all are probably very familiar with at this point, and also our fave, Sandra Herrera from CBS Sports and Chicago native, who can walk us through how we got here, let's just say. After that, we're going to be talking about a different kind of change, one that we're calling a generational handover. We've been trying our best to keep up with the number of retirement announcements that really started last calendar year, and have certainly continued on to this calendar year, this NWSL season. We're looking at some names, the big ones who have announced their retirement and what that means, specifically in the U.S. Women's National Team realm, what it means in terms of who might be stepping up into some of these places that will soon be officially super vacant. But before we get into that, let's talk U17 World Cup. Meg,
The youths are back.
The youths are back. The youths are back. And Meg, I was pretty surprised to learn that the U.S. U17s have never won a World Cup before. This is a big one for them.
Yeah, no, I think it will be really interesting. And, I think we've already seen this kind of narrative around someone like Melanie Barcenas from San Diego, taking on number 13 with the pink pre-wrap and everything, and then immediately scoring that banger against Korea as they advance out of the group stage. So, I mean, we're seeing encouraging things, right? Like, I think, all the takeaways that we got from that U20 episode, right, is just how do you grow the youth and the development so that way you are getting that pathway to the senior national team. And so having another opportunity, another World Cup to look at that young talent and some talent that is already in the NWSL, again, right, like, the times they are changing, to say the least, in terms of how these players are, where they're coming from as they head into a World Cup like that. So it's going to be interesting to watch and see how far they advance and what the expectations are on them, because maybe I think it is a little bit different in that they never have won.
Absolutely. And it's inevitable that once you have younger folks playing in professional leagues, of course, that's going to draw more eyes to wherever these players are. So I think maybe 5-10 years ago, there might not have been as much of an attention or sense of urgency paid.
It's like, how would you even watch it?
First of all, the access, of course. But now that there are players like Melanie Barcenas, Kennedy Fuller, who are showing up and representing for country. And of course, it doesn't help when they score bangers, as you mentioned. Definitely.
In like 30 seconds too. Like, ooh, boy. I remember seeing like, the game's starting, and I had not even managed to like get to a TV, and then they were tweeting out video, and I was like, oh, okay. So it's serious now. Cool.
We're here. Yep. So if you are just now catching up with the U17 Women's World Cup, know that you can watch the U.S. in the Dominican Republic in the quarterfinals this Saturday. They're playing Nigeria, which is sure to be a can't miss. Get your popcorn popped this Saturday. Don't miss. And before we get into the rest of the episode, I just want to say that if you are like us, for better or worse, chronically online and have been seeing reactions starting with Boss Nation, continuing into Chicago Stars FC, the reactions very strong, many of which warranted. all of which welcomed, especially on social media. Yes, it's real, but also I think it's important for us to just take a half step back and recognize that this wouldn't even be possible. We wouldn't even be having such intense discourse if the NWSL did not survive long enough for teams to even have the luxury of rebranding.
100%. Yeah, and we're in year 12. Like, what a
more
concept.
Than a decade in existence.
Yeah.
That has like never happened before.
Yep.
And it's easy to lose track of that, right, Meg? In the midst of everything, the announcements, the colors, the alignment or lack thereof.
I think we take it for granted. Like 100%, we take it for granted, and that is something that I think is really important context of. We're seeing the generational handoff from player to player, and we're seeing people like Merritt Mathias, who we discussed last week, and like what an NWSL career means. But now there is the sense of, when we think about like how do you become fans of a team, for so many of us it's just like, well, who did my parents support, or like where did I grow up, or and for me, for fandom, like it's like, okay, when I went to college I picked up the Washington Capitals as a team. When I moved to New York I picked up the New York Liberty, right? Like there are these actual physical connections, and so now that the NWSL has existed long enough to allow for these things to grow and flourish, like it's actually kind of cool that we get to have these fights all the time.
100%. And I just think it's important for us to note that, because people's feelings are understandably very strong about some of these changes, but the changes are also in themselves a marker of growth. So just hold that as you listen to the conversations that we're going to have in this episode. Last thing, we know that you guys have been watching the offseason. We've been following it too. We are definitely going to be talking about it, just letting you know that we're on top of it. But if you have thoughts, and I'm sure you do, reach out to us because we love hearing from you. DM us, send us an email. Make sure you're following us at TA Fulltime on Instagram and TikTok. Send us an email, fulltime@theathletic.com. Even if you still have lingering thoughts about Boss Nation FC, but certainly if you have any about Chicago Stars FC.
Every time you say Chicago Stars FC, I'm just like, that's not right.
Anyway, I mean,
we'll get into it.
We're going to get all the way into it. And speaking of emails, thank you so much to Ann R. for, one, listening to my sort of theorizing from Full-Time Review, which you should also be listening to, our new review show that drops every Monday. But Anne heard me sort of wondering how it was that the likes of Megan Rapinoe and Ali Krieger were able to both be in Harrison, New Jersey to send Kelley O'Hara off into beautiful retirement, and also in Brooklyn at Barclays for Game 5, Liberty Lynx. Apparently, and to my total surprise, Pino and Krieger took the PATH train. I could not, honestly, because that possibility never crossed my mind, because it's the PATH train. If you know, you know, and it's a Sunday PATH. If you know,
but like if you know what time, like as long as you got that target time, it's totally feasible. If you've got it down to like, but my question is, who was the mom friend doing that timing?
Yeah,
because Pino, I love you. It's not you. It's not you, girl.
Meg said it, not me. But I love details like that, because when I saw them in the stadium, I was like, wait, how did you guys pull off what I didn't even, I mean, that's why they're the GOATs, I guess.
Yeah.
But thank you, Anne, for filling in that mystery for me, because I probably would have kept thinking about it. Anne actually ran into Pino and got a really sweet selfie with her. She said she was super open. Even by the time she saw them, they were surrounded by a few fans, 8 to 10 people who also recognized them. So Anne, thank you for writing in. Thank you for following the show. Thank you for sharing our same curiosity and making sure that we're all informed. All right, when we get back, we're going to get into some more of these changes. Welcome back to the pod. Steph Young, staff writer for The Athletic, who has the inside scoop on this Chicago rebrand. Steph, what are sort of the top line items that we need to understand about how we got here, how we got from Chicago Red Stars to Chicago Stars FC?
Well, when I spoke to Kay Bradley, who's CMO for the Chicago Stars, which it's a little bit confusing because they're not switching over permanently till 25. So while I was with the article, I was like, is it still red? I guess it's still technically Red Stars. she mentioned it was a 6-month process. This was something that the owner, Laura Ricketts, wanted to do kind of right away when she came on. But they had some immediate problems, right? Like being 12th out of 12 teams, having to eventually find a new coach, ensuring Mel Swanson stayed in Chicago. And they got all that settled down. They're in playoffs. Lauren Donaldson has things that looks like kind of under control there. So now they can finally focus on stuff like a rebrand. We can, discuss whether or not a rebrand was totally necessary, but clearly they felt it was. And so here we are after many discussions. They said they spoke to players about what they wanted. They spoke to fans. They brought in, obviously, supporters group Chicago Local 134. And they also talked to people. This is typical, right, in marketing research about not just why do you like the Chicago Red Stars, but if you're new or an outsider, why don't you like the Chicago? Like, why aren't you that, like, deep, intense fan? What can we do to capture your interest there? I think that's an important question that a lot of teams need to do to capture, like, more than the flash in the pan. People are like, oh, let's see what this is about, like, keeping them around. So that's how we got from there to here. They had 2 different firms. Obviously, one was the creative agency and one is the launch agency. But that's how these things tend to go.
Just, Steph, one of the things that really struck me out of that article was this idea from Kay Bradley that when people are talking about the team, they maybe used to abbreviate to Red Stars instead of Chicago. And I feel like we've seen some discussion of this as an idea because when I think about how I talk about teams, I feel like everyone's default is to drop the city name. Like you're either referring to them as the city name in a certain context or you are referring to the nickname. And I think there is this idea that they know that they've got to make a better path into the Chicago market, right? And it just feels like, at least on that first emotional hit of, this is a reach in trying to solve that problem rather than the actual bigger problem, which is they don't play in Chicago.
Right. The overall sense that I got from talking to Kay and from the launch, which may not be obviously 100% accurate though, but the sense that I got is that there is a concern with the team not being recognizable enough in Chicago. So they're trying to lean harder onto the Chicago side of the name, and they wanted something that was a little bit more obvious. I know everybody's been slam dunking the ball, which represents soccer, right? But that is part of the thing where they want people to be able to see that when you just walk around and you see a sports crest, there is a level of do you recognize it instantly or not? And some of that just comes with sometimes teams are literally 100 years old, right? Yep. And that's not a fair comparison that you get to make. But, some of it is about design elements. I was talking to her. It reminded me of Matt Groening, who does The Simpsons, where he talked about what's good character design. And one of the elements is if you take every other detail out and you just have the outline, do you instantly know what the character is? And I kind of think the same thing applies to brands, where if you remove all the words or the labels and you just have one element. So, for example, that red star, right, the central motif inside the soccer ball, and you saw that at a distance, would you be like, that's our women's soccer team in the city? Maybe, maybe not. I think I actually do like that central element in the crest, the design of the ball with the little elements around the central star. We'll see how that plays out. Some of it was just about spending the money to get your brand in front of people's eyes. But yeah, I did get the sense that they really want to ramp up the team's marketability and brand recognition.
One of the bigger questions that I have, which is both about this specific club and what various NWSL teams are trying to do when it comes to identity, is the ball representing soccer in conflict with football club. How do we think through that, Steph? Because the maybe critical part of my brain is wondering if this insistence, again, not just with Chicago, we see this across the NWSL, across MLS as well, with FC and sort of embodying the European and in most other parts of the world way of referring to the sport, with also the insistence of and reality of how we refer to it in the U.S. as soccer. Did they speak to that at all, about that sort of discrepancy? Because I think it's left some people kind of confused.
No, they didn't. which maybe is on me for not going into as deeply as I should have, because I think at this point, some things like the FCSC schism or whatever, it like you're so done with thinking about it. And I think the FC thing in general, we can probably all guess, is maybe a market research thing where their like audiences indicate that they find FC legitimizes your brand in terms of soccer more than SC, and SC signals it's too American. So it also drives off an international audience, something like that. And I'm like, okay, if the club is going to go off of that, we'll see how it goes. Maybe there will be a club that wants to really lean into that. That's like, yeah, we're a soccer club. And if you don't like our American brand, then you can go watch Ajax or something and have a great time.
Yeah, I mean, Columbus Crew did actually go for the SC. I mean, I think they had their own branding journey. But, I mean, it is interesting to maybe step back and put the Chicago rework into the bigger context of just, like, there is this strange urge in American soccer to like constantly be tinkering with the brand like every 5-10 years. And I mean, we saw it with Chicago Fire, and I mean, some of it, to be fair, like to Tamerra's point at the top of the show, we now are in a place where it's over a decade in. You can say maybe some of the stuff from the first round is a little more dated, right? And MLS has obviously gone through kind of getting rid of some of those OG badges that teams had. The Revs were, I think, one of the last main ones to fall. But I think there's also an argument, too, that ends up severing history, and it ends up, like, you lose that history and you lose that original identity in favor of something that feels a little more, like, sterile. And, I mean, I don't know if I'd be as annoyed by this if the crest did not feel like... It just doesn't feel like a pro crest to me. It feels like a youth level.
It's really giving ECNL.
Yeah. I don't even know if I have a question for you here, Steph. I think it's more just like, how do we balance that? Because I get the Chicago Red Stars have a history that is extremely complicated, right? And like a more recent history that is extremely complicated. And I think there is this urge to have that very strict separation between the previous era and everything that came with it, even though the name was a name voted through a fan poll back at the start of WPS, right? Like, it is not an Arnhem Whistler thing, but then you have all this stuff piled on top of it, and it feels really easy to be like, okay, we gotta start with something else here.
I mean, I can respect a desire, you know, not just the Arnhem of it all, but to be like, I want to put my stamp on something that I paid a lot of money for.
Yep. And
we're entering a new era of NWSL in general, overall, and I can understand kind of wanting to fit in with that vibe as well. And I think there's actually, I'm not in ad spaces. I'm by no means one of those ad people who understands all the trends and stuff, but there does feel anecdotally like in general there has been a flattening of branding, where you look at a mix of corporate logos from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? And you have really distinctive ones that stick out, and then they all get redesigned, because sports is not the only space where people love a brand redesign. And they kind of all have this flattened, there's a lot of sans serif fonts, there's a lot of very generic-looking word marks, you know what I mean? It's along the same lines of, you don't have businesses with their own identifiable buildings anymore because they want to have resale value. So you don't get the Pizza Hut shaped Pizza Hut. It's just a generic gentrification square so that you can swap out the signs. That's the same vibe to me. Yeah. And so I do wonder if that's sneaking into sports a little bit. It's not just a sports problem.
I think something else that can really make or break a rebrand launch is timing. And that's, I think, another big question mark that I had about this. I mean, even when we introduced you, Steph, we didn't know whether to call them still the Chicago Red Stars, which, yes, technically they are through the end of the season, or if we need to start respecting and implementing this new name, Chicago Stars FC. I don't understand the decision to announce this right now in the middle,
also like a week after Boston, right? Like,
yeah, maybe that's why they did it.
The pump has been primed
now's the
for
time
everyone to
when
be
everyone's
so mad.
Yeah. And I just, I'm curious if you like learned anything about the decision process behind announcing it right now when the season is still going, when they've already, made made it clear that this is a new era for this club. You know, the Wrigley Field match was incredible, and in some ways could sort of serve as that bridge into the whatever they're planning for next season. But what are your thoughts also about the timing?
Yeah, we talked a lot more about the meaning of the new crest and how they were going to deploy it, and like this little thing that they're going to do. It's not that little, about like they're going to put the crest on kind of neighborhood stores and businesses around Chicago, right, for people to be able to name as a way to like try to tie people into the community. If I had to guess, based on them talking about, you know, it's been 6 months, maybe longer of a process, at some point maybe you just want it out there. And maybe there's also something about the timing with like Q3, Q4, something to get the merch ball rolling. I think when you look at timing, my first guess is always money. That's usually a pretty good first guess on the why of anything. Sometimes it's just like there is like not really a great explanation. Some people just want to do it then, but my first guess is always money. They did have the merch ready to go last night.
Yeah, holiday shopping time, right?
That's a good point.
All right, Steph, let's maybe just close this out here. Does this rebrand feel like one where even by the time next year starts, we're all just like, it's fine, whatever, right? Like it does feel like it's in a different category compared to Boston, where everyone is still like, okay, but you got to change the name, right? Whereas here it does feel like the more you sit with it, the more it's like, it's actually fine, probably.
Yeah. I saw, you know, percentage-wise, a lot more of like, yeah, it's fine, to outright people being like, yeah, I like the change. Maybe not like the most enthusiastic, like, wow, it knocked me off my feet, but like, especially contrasted to Boston, I did see like a notable amount of people like, yeah, I can accept that. Yeah, some of the pushback does feel a little bit like I don't like change. I'm the same way, where I take about a week, and then after that I'm like, you know what, the initial feeling faded, and I'm like, it's acceptable at the very least. So I do think by the time, and you know what, the other thing is when you see something on a uniform, like a full kit, and it's got all the sponsorship and the numbers and stuff in place, things do tend to look different. So seeing it in isolation, you know, from its Illustrator or whatever version to actually getting put on a uniform, I do think will change some minds. And then other people who don't like it no matter what, well, if they're never going to like it, then it's fine.
That's a good point. And yes, the shock of it is, of course, going to elicit very strong reactions, but we have time to sort of get acquainted with these changes. And I totally agree with what you said, that some people will never like it, and that's okay. They're entitled to that. But Steph, thank you so much, both for your reporting. Make sure, if you have not already read Steph's piece on this new rebrand, check that out at The Athletic. Thank you also for your personal thoughts. We always value those. And I'm sure it'll just be a matter of time before we have you back on the pod.
I appreciate it. Look, we all are people who, in our own ways, don't like change on and off the field, so.
I do think one of my most interesting takeaways from this is that, having looked now at the 2017, I'm like, it's actually probably not that good, right? Like, I feel like the kits and the Chicago-ness of it all, I was like, oh, it's a pretty good, and then now I'm like, oh, no, it could have used some improvement. But I do think, you know what, we got to bring in pure Chicago, Sandra Herrera, to like walk us through it from that viewpoint, because I just know, like, I wouldn't want to listen to anyone talking about a town that isn't my own. So we got to go to an expert. All right. We are joined by one of the best people in women's soccer. Truly. Sandra Herrera, but who's going to be the voice of Chicago. You got to put an entire city on your back. Get ready.
No pressure.
Right? Like, I mean, like, we know the background. You're all set. Just, like, maybe walk us through it in terms of your personal reaction before maybe we get into some of the bigger question marks around this rebrand.
I think my own first reactions, kind of chatting with folks ahead of the launch and seeing some of the imaging ahead of our breaking, it was definitely like, oh, this is a rebrand. Like a rebrand is happening. And there was also a layer of, okay, finally, because I think for some folks who are, whether they find themselves covering the team, whether they find themselves just season ticket holders or deeply invested in Chicago women's soccer, it also, there was a little bit of like, not finality, but like, okay, this is part of that next step. So I would argue that there was a layer of like natural progression in that with a new wave of ownership and an influx of resources, eventually something like a rebrand or a retweak would find its way into the Chicago market, and it has arrived. And I think in terms of like your just very minimum standards, I think they achieved their goal of wanting to just sort of keep things as simple as possible. I think when you remove a lot of some of the noise, you're just like, there is a red star in the middle of the crest, and there's a soccer ball that happens to be part of that because
The soccer ball represents soccer.
because the soccer ball represents soccer. That's right. I love it. With Fight Club, we don't talk about it. We just say the soccer represents soccer. So yeah, I think there's a wide spectrum of reaction, like any kind of rebrand launch. And I think for me, it just sort of felt like the logical next step.
And Sandra, of course, like you said, everyone's going to have their reactions. Everyone's entitled to their opinions. Everyone has different aesthetic, visual, emotional sort of like sensibilities that are going to inform those reactions. But can you place this rebrand in the context of being from Chicago? And I mean, from like the multiculturalism, the rich history, especially when it comes to like art and architecture. What do you feel that this rebrand is sort of speaking to the things that makes Chicago so distinct as a city?
I'm going to say it maybe misses the mark on some of those things. I think there's one very specific element, or well, maybe two very specific elements that you maybe want to see represented within any type of sports iconography. And if you're from Chicago, it's Chicago, number one, literally just the city that we're from and we're repping. And number two, like an element that is going to tie you with that. I think we have to throw out things like, a Chicago Bears that has like a 200-year run-up of branding in the city, or even a Chicago Cubs or whomever. And when you're looking at newer sports franchises in this city, that's like the number one thing you have to capitalize. And if there's a way to sort of connect that and tie that into the city, why do that? And I think for a very long time, 20 years almost, that's part of what the intention was behind something like a Red Stars brand, which not only made it a tie to the city specifically, but also presented a layer of unique naming for NWSL teams at the time in its decade-long history. But I think that when we're looking at, again, more recent rebrands, even if we want to bring in the Chicago Fire to this, they also were like, what we need in our crest? A Chicago Red Star. And so they went ahead and they rebranded that. And here we see this like next iteration of Chicago's NWSL team, and they dropped a word, but they kept a star. And some would argue maybe it's the only star you need, because at one point this was a franchise that navigated with like 5 stars, like just always kind of crammed on a crest. And that's supposed to be, a direct pull from the city's flag. And so that was always the tie-in to that. And so I think, when maybe this branding, this imaging continues to get kind of that official hard launch in 2025, and the conversations around getting the team into a more centralized part of Chicago kind of intersect once again, that's going to make all of this make a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah, I did want to talk to you about the flag, because I think I've heard some really convincing arguments of they had to step away from the Chicago flag because it's not the Chicago Red Stars. It's just literally you're looking at a Chicago flag, and there's not necessarily this thing that makes it the NWSL team, right? That there is that confusion level. Do you feel like they did enough to get away from is that a priority in your mind too?
Yeah, I think a little bit when we're comparing images, I think if we're even throwing it back to that very first crest with like the wavy kind of stars, like it's giving flag in the wind, right? Yep. And then you still have like 4 stars and a main centralized red star. And then even when they did a bit of that retweak in 2017 to kind of honor their 10 years, there was still an emphasis on cramming as many stars as possible into a crest. And like, not gonna lie, like as a Chicagoan, I love that shit. I'm sorry if we can't cuss on this. I apologize. But we love that shit. There are people who come to this city, and put in 4 years of undergrad, and by the time they leave, they're eating Italian beefs for breakfast and walking out of here with a Red Star kind of tattoo on themselves. You know what I mean? Like that's how quickly and deeply people fall in love with the cities who are not natives like me, like born here and raised here. But like that's part of the energy. So of course you love that stuff. It was even a little weird for me. Like it's gonna take some getting used to and adjustment for me as well. But attempts to simplify things, make things look cleaner, and kind of have this be that first step, because there's been a lot of that from the franchise as well. It's like there's new ownership. What's going to come next? Here are some things that are coming next. These are like tangible things that they can point at and say, these are things that we're doing. And hopefully, right, fingers crossed for women's soccer goodness in general, that like eventually will lead to things like areas for training facilities or eventual solutions for a more Chicago-specific type of stadium. So I think this is maybe step one or step 1.5, possibly 2 of like what it's supposed to be for this franchise.
Yeah, I really like thinking of it as step 1 rather than, I think when I was thinking about it initially, it felt like a Band-Aid, right? And if you think about it instead of the first step of a process, it does. I think like there's no reason to not think of this in good faith, right? That this is part of a new era, part of this new ownership. So I do thank you, Sandra, for swinging by and like
settling
maybe talking
the nerves.
us down from the ledge a little bit, right? Like that initial, there's an emotional reation when change happens. It's just part of life.
Yes, there's a knee jerk for sure. I mean, like I said, it's a little weird for me too. There's, I think, shout out to the chief marketing officer, that there's not there's a kind of energy that comes with like being from Chicago, and where it's like it's not arrogant, but it's definitely like we definitely boast ourselves. It's like it's a fine line that we walk, and it's sort of interesting to sort of see that dynamic kind of play out in this design, where it's like this franchise is going from a crest where they couldn't have jammed enough specific Red Stars into the crest, and now they're just going to where it's just like a singular Red Star, which I think is something at the end of the day does resonate with Chicagoans and the people who they're trying to capture a little bit along the way. And I like that in some of the feedback from players that was equally as important to them too. It didn't matter if they were players who've been playing here for a very long time or players who just got here. They wanted to make sure that certain components still stood in there. And it's funny to sort of know that it's Chicago and make sure there's a star in there. And like those are the things to kind of tie things together. So I guess we'll revisit this in a year or two, see how people feel then.
Yeah, 100%. We got to bring back our number 1 Chicago expert, Sandra Herrera.
Our
thank
Chicago
you for
star.
joining us today.
Oh, thanks, gang. Appreciate y'all.
Meg, the changes continue. And like I said at the top of the show, these changes, specifically when it comes to the OGs, the veterans, the GOATs announcing their retirements, technically started last year. But it's time now. We've reached critical mass. There have been more than enough for the heart announcements of retirements for us to just take stock of what this all means and what we can expect moving forward. So where would you like to start? The biggest one was Megan Rapinoe's, right? Or should we go back even further?
I do think we have to start in kind of that 2023 final territory because, like, yes, Julie Ertz's retirement is a one-of-one scenario, so I almost think we can, just like set it aside of, like, surprise, she's back, and she's gone again, right? Mm-hmm. Like, Julie Ertz has her own deal going. But then when you think about the narrative that we ended the 2023 championship on with this, like, it's the final game, Megan Rapinoe, Ali Krieger, right? Like, both of these people want to raise a trophy. And so to end on that note, and then 2024 starts with Tori Huster officially retiring. And while, like, she might not have the same name recognition, that's a player that, again, has been with the league since the jump, is hugely important in an NWSL PA context. But then, like, yeah, the last 2 months have just been, it's like emotional whammy after emotional whammy.
Truly. It's been, every month it's felt like at least one. I mean, I'm thinking of Sinead Farley as well, who, and I think, I mean, we spoke about this a little bit last week when we were discussing Merritt Mathias, another one, people who had these stellar, highly impactful careers within the NWSL that maybe did not translate, if at all, into the national team space. But if you follow the NWSL, you know these names. And there's something really symbolic that I still think Merritt describes so beautifully about being able to walk away at a time like this for the league. I mean, we've been talking at length already on this very show about the fact that the league has survived long enough for people to be able to walk away from the same league that they started, you know, without it being a reiteration of something that recently folded. So there is something that I have to assume that it adds to the significance and sort of the pride that these players are feeling being able to walk away at a time like this.
Yeah, I mean, I also think what is really interesting, and I guess is almost like a sub-narrative of this, is in some cases for players too, there is this external pressure of like their bodies can't perform anymore, right? And Sam Mewis, right, like when we were going through our list of players to talk about in this generational handover, like we all struggle to remember Sam Mewis because it has been so long since we saw her play, but the official announcement of her retirement happened January of this year. And I think between her and Kelley O'Hara, and both of them were like very honest and vulnerable about just the actual physical part of like what it takes out of you to play at this level. Merritt Mathias too, I think, has spoken very openly about, you know, her health impacting the level of play that she was able to go through on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, there is kind of this sense of like, yes, we've got all of these generations of players maybe like handing it off to the next one, but also the sense of how much of it is players hanging on, how much of it is players like, I still got to make money, right? Like there's also the financial part of it too, of like only now are they just able to kind of secure the bag for themselves in a way that wasn't happening before. And so, yeah, there's just so many things that are informing this conversation. Or you have someone like Alex Morgan, right? Who had this retirement happen kind of very unexpectedly. You did not get the big narrative buildup. So it's a big convo.
Right. It's hard to even identify two retirements that have been alike in terms of the circumstances of the retirement, where the player was in terms of their performance, their level of fitness, their health. And I think I'm just thinking about Sam Mewis, and to me, I think one of the things that sort of obscured her retirement was the fact that she never went away. Yeah. You know, she immediately, and shout out to her, that transition was as smooth as it was when she played. You know, she went straight from pitch to, I mean, businesswoman essentially, with the women's game. And I think even that is a symbol of how much things have changed. The fact that some players are able to make those transitions where we're still seeing them, obviously in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, Megan Rapinoe, Ali Krieger, like that list right now, it really is interesting in a way where I think, you know, jobs in this space are always very limited, but what is happening is people are creating things where they didn't exist before. And so that is, I think, opening up this avenue of you can even have it happen before. And I think we're seeing that with Kelley O'Hara, right? Like her work with Just Women's Sports, the fact that she's kind of present in that role and you know, like that's not going to go anywhere. So I think that also even changes the emotional impact of this, because those voices aren't, like, we're not hearing less from Alex Morgan or Kelley or, like, all of these players. So that, I think, also adds to this kind of strangeness of this moment where before, like, maybe you get, like, one or two of them in TV broadcasting, but that's not what's happening.
Yeah, they're all still around. Like, it was one type of goodbye, but it certainly wasn't like a final, we're never going to see you again.
Yeah. It's like, actually, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, bye.
Right. Just a different platform. Yeah. I'm in your ears now instead of just on your TV. Some of them are both places, and they're all the better for it. But I do think that looking at the absences that a lot of these players are going to be leaving behind on the field, especially when I think about players like Pino, who is essentially irreplaceable in many ways, players like Alex Morgan, and especially when we think about the roles that they occupied on the U.S. women's national team, there is that question of who is going to step up and fill in those spots left behind, if it's even like a like for like fit, because this next generation is bringing something totally different, both in terms of their style of play and certainly their personas as public figures, as celebrities. Do you think that it's as simple of a question as like who is going to be the next Alex Morgan, or is it who, do we need to broaden it or just change the question altogether?
I mean, I do think that the framing, that's what we've been learning over the past couple of years, is that the framing has to be completely reworked, because I think what we saw even at this Olympics, right, is there was all that discourse about Alex Morgan not being on the roster, right, which I think is totally to be expected and part of the sport and covering it and all that kind of stuff. But then the storyline that emerged out of the Olympics is triple espresso.
Yeah.
Right? So you get this frontline unit of Sophia Smith, Trinity Rodman, Mal Swanson as a unit. And what was very fun, too, about it was that they would all talk about each other and hype each other up. And it's like, I don't care who scores. Like, one of us is going to handle it. It's good, right? And so I think there is this sense of you don't need that Alex Morgan type anymore, right? Because that was one of the really interesting parts of the discussion around her retirement, is what other players were saying about her. And Megan Rapinoe had a really good, interesting thing of like, Alex Morgan was the commercial face of this team for a really long time and was able to get us into spaces that we wouldn't have been able to get into, or open doors for the rest of us that weren't about to be opened. And now a lot of those fights have been settled. And whether that's like actual fight of like equal pay, or if it's just the sort of more symbolic, like women's sports are on the rise. And so there is now, I think, this sense of players can have that pressure taken off of them. And kind of, it's a different ask right now.
Completely. I'm reminded of what Alex Morgan said to Naomi Girma ahead of the World Cup last year, when I think the team had arrived for training. It was like right before the big media day, and the players had received paychecks for like a retroactive payment in light of the equal pay. And I think Naomi Girma was like, "Ooh, I wish I could get a paycheck," or something like that. And Alex was like, no. It's better actually that you don't get this back pay because it means you don't have to deal with this. And I think that when I think about that sort of exchange, and of course, we kind of laughed about it in the moment, but putting that exchange in the context of now, the fact that that generation did so much work, so much running, essentially, so that this generation could walk, so that they could make informed decisions, really that place themselves at the center without having to think so much about what this means for the next generation. What door do I need to be leaving open for someone who might be coming behind me, whether or not it's something that I actually want to do? And I think that's when I think about, the sort of public personas of Sophia Smith, Trinity Rodman, Mal Swanson. I mean, yes, they're triple espresso, but as individuals, they have charted very different paths for themselves from a business perspective, from a marketing perspective, from a celebrity perspective. And I don't know that's something that we would have been able to enjoy before from so many different players. So the fact that it's different is, I think, a positive marker for change. But do you think there still needs to be a face? Like, do we still need that person that we sort of put forth at the ESPYs to represent?
Who's the ambassador to the normies, right? Like,
right.
I mean, I think that there is value in that, just in terms of like having that sort of breakout person has always advanced women's soccer. And to be clear, I think it's a totally thankless role.
Yeah.
For whoever ends up in that role. But I do think also having someone that like has that higher name recognition again puts you into spaces that you might not necessarily otherwise be in. But it is extra work, right? It is absolutely 1000% extra work, and like there are perks to it, but also like they have some double-edged sword value to them as well. So like, I don't even know, we were talking about this too, like leading up to the podcast, like who is that leading candidate for the breakout person, or who is that leading candidate for someone who's going to be like spicy on the field in terms of leadership, right? Like there's not necessarily these kind of like clear-cut candidates to take on these roles. And I think the question too is, are they even interested in taking on these roles? Or do they want to just say like, no, actually we can live over here in our little worlds and it'll be fine. like, we're good with, like, you know, Sophia Smith has her Nike ad or whatever it is. And, like, that's the highest she's willing to go in terms of, like, that extra work.
Mm-hmm. The only unanimous opinion, I think, when it comes to the face, specifically when it comes to leadership, is, of course, Naomi Girma. She is someone who I think people have been ready, even when she was earning her first cap with the senior team.
Oh, yeah.
It was, I mean, there was no question. There was no sense of transition. There was no, let's give her time. Let's,
Nope.
you know, get her some mentorship.
Nope.
People have been ready. People are
We were
ready
like,
now.
okay, put the crown on.
She's her.
Yeah.
She's her.
Right.
When it comes specifically to leadership, I mean,
Yes.
she's well beyond her years in that sense, but that is one specific path, and I don't know that is necessarily going to, I don't know if it's something that she's interested in, it bleeding over to, as you described, the sort of ambassador to the normies. But when it comes to on the field, I think that is the one guarantee.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Everybody, like, that is already, like, sorry to Naomi, there's no election process for you, right? Like, it's just, just wait.
Unanimous
It's going to
decision.
happen. But what I do find really interesting about Naomi Girma is how she has already taken this approach to, like, she has a deeply personal cause in the mental health element in terms of, like, what she has done in that retreat for NWSL players, right? And,
Yep.
like, you can already see her adding these pieces in together, and that, I think, she now has the freedom to be like, this is my thing. And I don't have to worry about being that ambassador or going out and fighting an equal pay fight or whatever. Like, I can have my thing, and this is my project, and it is deeply personal to me because of my connections at Stanford to Katie Meyer, and, like, this is going to be my thing that I own, right? And that is a gift in a lot of ways too, right? That this older generation has kind of set up of, like, okay, we've accomplished these things, and now you can have your single thing that you deal with.
Absolutely. And I think another aspect, when I think about a player's career and the opportunities available to them, that the previous generation has really opened up for the current generation, is the ability to take their careers to more places than they may have been able to before. I know you've mentioned before, Meg, that when Alex Morgan dared to play a little Champions League ball, it was sort of like a
The
potential
NWSL, what's
implosion.
going to happen to the NWSL? Yeah, 100%. There is this sense of the league is not in this, like, survive at all costs mode. You can have Lindsey Horan, the current captain of the team, go play in France, and everyone's like, okay,
Bye.
cool,
See you when you
right?
get
Like,
back.
it doesn't actually impact the health of the league. I think there were fears, absolutely, because she was coming off of, like, this really great campaign in Portland. She was an MVP. She was, she was a very key piece of that team. And then when she said, I'm going to go off to France, and then she stayed there, the pressure of that got lifted over time. So there is, again, like, these players can be selfish in a way that is actually, like, that's what you want for them. They can prioritize their careers, what they want to do, if they want to go play overseas, all that kind of cool stuff. Like, they don't have to freak out anymore that, like, oh no, what is it going to do?
Exactly. And with all of the, complicated, varied emotions that we're all going to have when we say goodbye to these players that really help shape our experience in women's soccer, no matter where we are within the ecosystem, I think that it helps me, at least, to sort of hold on to the fact that the things, like, they are leaving the game so transformed and giving the younger players opportunities that they didn't have, which is what so many of them have said at length. But to actually see it happen in real time is really significant. I think I want to talk really quickly about some international players, because Alex Popp from Germany, Amandine Henry from France, and of course, Marta, who needs no further description.
But we also have to, I think, mention too, like, Desi Scott and KC and Christine Sinclair, right? Like,
my brain blocked it out just from denial.
So I think there is this sense too of, it's not just a US thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, there is this transformational generation, right? Like, Marta and Christine Sinclair in particular, like, those two perfect players where you look at them, and to be fair, Marta is not apparently ready to be done yet in league play. Like, that's what she says, at least, right? I think it might be a year by year thing. But there is this sense of, like, Marta came in later, but we're seeing that like beautiful story happening right now in Orlando that we've already talked about a huge amount. But Christine Sinclair, I mean, when she joined the league and they were like, where do you want to play? And she literally would only answer Portland 3 times, right? Like, she has also been such a key part of this league and international soccer in general. But when you think about Pop or Amandine Henry, like, all of these players have such big key pieces to what we think about now as the game of women's soccer. So there is this, like, it's not just happening here, it's everywhere. The emotions are coming at all directions.
100%. We're all going to get through this together. It's going to be hard. There will be some tears shed, but it's time. And I can only, just based on what we have heard from some of these players about their decision, I know Alex Morgan was very intentional about the video that she recorded, Desiree Scott as well. You can tell that, I mean, these are not light decisions. And the fact that they are even able to make them seemingly without the pressures of how is this going to affect my livelihood. It seems like all of the players who've announced their retirements do have some other pathway that they had been sort of paving even while they were playing. And that in itself, I think, is a huge marker of progress. I will say that the only thing in terms of who is going to step up into this spot, I'm thinking about Kelley O'Hara. I'm thinking about the dog factor. I'm not just talking about on the field, because you have players like Sam Coffey who are going to do what needs to be done. I'm talking about the person who is a little bit scary, like legitimately scary to their own teammates when the time calls for it in the game, and can dig something out of them that is like sticky and ugly and dark, but necessary. And when I look at even, the expanded roster of the U.S. women's national team, I'm not seeing it yet. I'm not saying that I never will.
Right.
I'm saying I'm seated and I'm ready.
Yeah. No, that is definitely one, because we've seen a little bit of it from Lindsey Horan, obviously World Cup. Like, there is that element to her, but also, like, you don't want your captain to right? Like, your captain has to be the responsible one who goes and talks to the refs and gets someone out of trouble. And so it is kind of funny to, like, have that be the captain right now, and just, like, I think at one point, like, Kelley O'Hara was talking her down. I was like, this is such a reversal. I don't know what's happening.
Right.
And so you do need, I think, that kind of, not necessarily a role player, but someone who is maybe like, slightly distanced from the captain role. I think generally you do hope it's a defender, like a defensive player of some kind, right? Like, I don't know. It's just like my brain is saying, like, mentally that's who I want that player to be.
Same.
And yet whether that's Sam Coffey is just like a lovely human being. And I'm like, I cannot see you getting into someone's face and pushing them in a way that is extremely annoying in the moment, but is going to produce results. And I totally, like, who is that next Kelley? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I don't either. I mean, the squishy agenda does not work well in Sam's favor when it comes to that. Love the squishy agenda. Yeah. The squishmallows. Yes, thank you. Sorry for mispronouncing
I'm
their
too
name.
old for it. I only know it because of the Sam Coffey / I see them at Costco.
Yeah. Oh, good to know.
Yep.
Well, Meg, that is going to be the thing that I will be on the lookout for with this set of upcoming friendlies. The U.S. women's national team on Thursday faces Iceland. They face them again on Sunday. And then on Wednesday, they're playing Argentina. That Iceland game the first one is going to be showing on TBS, Universo, and Max. The second Iceland fixture, TNT, Universo, True TV, and Max. And then the Argentina game on Wednesday, TNT, Universo, True Max, and True TV and Max. Tongue twister.
Who doesn't love all of the various TNT, they all have very silly names.
Many ways for you to follow along.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm going to be looking out for who is sort of showing evidence of having that dog factor that they can sort of step into as like a permanent role on the team. What are you going to be looking out for? These are some interesting matchups.
Yeah, I mean, they're both interesting matchups, but it feels hard. The October, like, this window in general is always such a weird timing, because, like, we're just really waiting for playoffs. I mean, Emma Hayes has at least said, like, listen, we're going to be rotating. You are not going to see the same lineup 3 times in a row. We cannot do that, because I got to send these players back off in the playoffs, right? So I think that is one thing that I'm looking for. I think we can expect first caps, we can expect rotation, we can see some new combos and see what we get out of it. But it's also, right at the moment, it's just kind of like, do we need these games right now? Like, yes, they are technically the victory tour for the Olympics. So, like, that also did limit who she could call up into these camps. But I'm just kind of like, the big game that I think everyone is waiting for, hilariously, is Thanksgiving weekend at Wembley, right? Like, that's the one that both is going to, I think, have more viewership and have bragging rights on the line. And, like, we're gonna see so many narratives of Emma Hayes going back to England, all that kind of stuff. So, like, for me, yes, I think we're going to learn stuff from these three, but I'm also just like, how much should we care about these three games?
Yeah, and I think maybe if we think about these games from a player perspective, especially those who are maybe earning their first call-ups or whose call-ups have been maybe inconsistent, I'm thinking of players like Ashley Sanchez.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we think about these friendlies as auditions to get onto that Wembley roster, because this is really the only shot.
We're back at the start of a cycle, right?
Yeah.
And like that first year or two in the cycle really is just kind of like, yes, like we're going to be getting a lot of data and, a lot of new looks. And like, I think Emma Hayes is going to take this team into very new places when it comes to the pool, right? Like, and we know we have that futures camp in January, but right at the moment, this does feel a little bit like a placeholder of like, we've got the two big games in Europe, and then we've got that futures camp, and I feel like we're gonna learn more from that outside point of view from both of those two other things than these three games. But at the same time, like, it's still three games. Like,
we're still gonna watch.
Ashley Sanchez getting back in the mix, Alyssa Thompson getting back in the mix, like, those parts of it are fun and exciting. And like, if Ashley Sanchez comes up with a banger, and is just like, what do you think of that, Vlaco? Right? Like, we're all going to be like, okay, we're seated. Thanks.
That's truly all it's going to take. And given how many new faces, how many changes, to touch on the theme of this episode, that we have seen in this 26-player roster, the chances seem high that there are going to be many, like, seatable moments.
Is Ashley Sanchez our next dog?
I literally got goosebumps when you said that.
Literally just, if you're watching this on video, you can see the thought enter my brain in real time.
And my sort of like mind-blown emoji face. I love that. I
could see it. I'll put it this way. I could see it.
And I love the juxtaposition of her kind of like crystals, like persona with what you see on the field. I need to sit with that, Meg. That you really, I was not, this was not in the show notes, people.
This was not in the show,
because it just
came in
raw,
real time.
Off the dome. I need a moment, but I love where you're going with this. You're going with this. Let us know what you think. Is Ashley Sanchez the next dog on the U.S. Women's National Team? And if not, who do you think is? We love to hear from you, as always, so please make sure, again, you're following us on all the places, sending us emails if you prefer that, fulltime@theathletic.com. And if you can't get enough, who could blame you? Make sure you sign up for a free newsletter at theathletic.com/fulltime. My name is Tamerra Griffin. I am alongside Meg Linehan, and you've been listening to Full Time with Meg Linehan. You will catch me somewhere in the world sitting with Ashley Sanchez, dog, somewhere in the world, on Twitter and Instagram, though I will always be there. Make sure you follow me.
I love derailing the episode at the last possible
I'm
moment.
here
But
for
also,
it.
like, if you listen to the end, congrats, you got real-time thinking. Who knew? So thank you for listening to the end of the show. We appreciate you.
This show does not happen without full-time producer Theo Lloyd Hughes, video producer Leah Griffin, and executive producer Emily Olson. We will be back in your podcast feed with a new Full-Time Review, our new little project that drops Mondays, and then, of course, on Thursdays, Full-Time with Meg Linehan. Thank you, as always, for listening, and we will see you soon.